second, I think, right?
Yep.
Second CSTPR seminar for the spring semester. And I want to advertise our future ones coming up before I introduce our speaker. I'm Lisa Dillon, by the way. I'm a faculty member here at the center. Today is January 29th. Our next one is February 26th, so put that one on your calendar. It's Materiality of the Virtual, Digital Technology and the Climate Crisis, ? So there you go. That's a good title. And we also have one on March 4th on guiding ozone layer recovery. Really interesting new results about the ozone layer, and we thought we had it covered, but then we discovered other things happening, and some of our scientists at NOAA really discovered some new information there. On March 4th, that'll be April 7th. We have a panel at the Conference on World Affairs. So that is an annual conference that CU puts on. People from all over the world actually come and participate, and we're sponsoring one of those talks with a very provocative title, Solve Climate by 2030. So if you've been wondering about that, that is going to be actually 5 to 7 p.m. in UMC 2235. Yeah, I've already quibbled with the title in two different dimensions, so.
It should be 2025, really.
Or, yeah.
Do we have that much time?
Can we solve it? I mean, there's just all sorts of questions about that. But that's awesome, and that's going to be April 7th as part of the Conference on World Affairs. April 8th, Sustainable Energy Talk about distributed justice, really important component of the sustainable energy landscape. And then our final one is on climate change, media consumption, and creative industries on April 27th by Brenda McNally. So we have a really great lineup, so do mark your calendars. And we always are going to have them online as well if you can't make it in person. So I hope to see you online or in the room for the next talks. But back to our main event today, which is to introduce my good friend Jason Delborne, who is a professor at, let me get this right, North Carolina State University. I knew Jason when he was actually a faculty member down at Colorado School of Mines, so just down the road. And he was a very active participant in a lot of the activities we've done here at the center over the years. And let's see, so he's also a faculty affiliate at CSPO, which is at Arizona State University, which stands for, I'm not going to say it, Science, Policy, and Outcomes. So his work and his influence and his networks really stretch across many different, I would say, world-class places in the United States and abroad as well in terms of his collaborations and the work he's been doing over the years. I just want to highlight one of his pieces of work that he's continuing on. I'm going to talk about more today too, on how to really effectively do public engagement and to set up deliberative spaces for people to engage in really tough questions like climate change. And he was part of this, I think it was global activity in preparation for some of the international treaty negotiations that actually really tried to say, how can we engage local people on the ground and get their views on what kinds of climate policies are practical and reasonable, and then feed that information back up to the larger negotiating bodies. And that was a really, really cool effort, a really big coordinated effort globally. Now Jason works in spaces, we just talked about gene drives and biotech and genetic engineering, and leads graduate programs there at NC State, as well as a lot of research, and we'll be hearing a lot about that today. So I'd really like to welcome Jason and thank him for coming. So thank you so much.
Thanks for that nice introduction, and it's really fun to be back here in Colorado. I think this is a great center, so I'm really happy to be an ongoing affiliate with the program and to be able to come and talk to you a little bit. I want to encourage you to just raise your hands and ask questions along the way. I don't assume that you all have deep backgrounds in biotechnology and gene drives and things like that. I don't think that's super important to understand my talk today, but feel free to jump in and ask questions. So today I'm going to focus in on stakeholder engagement, and I'll talk a little bit about what that means, especially around emerging biotechnologies. So I'm part of the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at NC State University. We're an interdisciplinary center. We have policy people, economists, historians, anthropologists, ecologists, geneticists. I'm in forestry and environmental resources. I could probably go on and on. We have a lot of different people working together around this question of what does it mean to think about the intersection of genetic engineering and synthetic biology technologies and society. And so our mission is to integrate scientific knowledge and public values in shaping the futures of biotechnology. So what I want to start with, and this is probably not an idea that's foreign to you all here at this center, but sometimes when I talk about this, it's it's a new thing to think about for audiences, is this tension that we have around democracy and expertise. And so what I would like to say is that in American political culture, we really believe in both things. So democracy, the idea that the will of the people, the preferences of the public matter in making decisions that affect us all. And we have lots of institutions in American government that work better or worse at different times to basically integrate public preferences into decision making. At the same time, our institutions are loaded with mechanisms to make sure that we draw on expertise to make good decisions. We don't simply imagine that every political decision that gets made around science and technology should be up to a popular vote, right? We value the contribution of experts. These things are in tension. And what I would say is that they're always going to be in tension. This is not something that we're going to solve overnight. There's not one model that takes care of these things and we're done with it. We just have to be aware that there's always going to be this tension, especially when we're making decisions about complex science and technology. So where I want to start is I want to talk a little bit about a report that I was involved in. So like Lisa, I was invited to be a part of a committee at the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, and we were asked to study gene drives. And this is we published our report in 2016. Very briefly, what is a gene drive? Because Lisa said you weren't exactly sure, so I don't expect everybody knows. A gene drive is a technique to bias inheritance to the next generation. So in sexually reproducing organisms, you would expect that if I have a trait, my offspring are going to get that trait about 50% of the time, right? With a gene drive, that ratio goes up. And so it's a way to drive a trait through a population of reproducing organisms. You could imagine the idea of genetic engineering a trait into an organism, releasing a small number of those organisms into an environment, and the population being transformed over time, which doesn't happen with regular genetic engineering unless there's a serious fitness advantage. So gene drives exist in nature, but recent technology around gene editing, especially with CRISPR-Cas9, which you probably heard about in the news, it's basically a gene editing technique, enables us to think about a way to produce a synthetic gene drive mechanism. And so that enables a new set of possible strategies for managing species and environments where we haven't been able to think about that before. So is that good enough?
Awesome.
Okay.
By the way, I wasn't on this committee in case anyone's confused.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
I'm on a different one, but
right.
I would have known what it was if I was on the committee.
Yeah. So the National Academies basically convenes groups of experts to study issues and produce reports. Yeah. And so this was on gene drives. The one you're working on is geoengineering. Yeah. So I'm not going to walk you through this report. It's excellent and it's long, but I want to highlight a couple of things. One of the things that was really unusual about this report is that our interdisciplinary scientific committee agreed on this statement, that public engagement cannot be an afterthought. This is a really big deal for the National Academies to say. They're usually very focused on the technology and the state of the science and what's possible and quantitative risk assessment and things like that. This committee was willing to say that for this kind of transformative technology, we need public engagement, not at the very end of the process, but along the way. We need that kind of input and social interaction around this technology before we get to a final product that's ready to be released. In fact, our committee said that the outcomes of engagement may be as crucial as the scientific outcomes to decisions about whether to release a gene-modified organism into the environment. Again, this may not sound like a big deal to you, but for the National Academies to say this is a very big deal. For this scientific body that's focused on the science to say that engagement and the way that this is talked about and discussed in society matters as much as the technical development is a huge deal. And so what did we say in this report? Yeah, Max.
Could I just ask, since you were dwelling in that space of process,
yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about if there were pockets of resistance, if you were the lead advocate, if there were other people that were advocating for that statement? Just a little bit more about, what led up to that articulation.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the truth is I actually can't talk about it. Okay. So one of the things that the National Academies says to the committee members is that all of our deliberations are completely off the record. And so I couldn't tell you the answers to those questions. What I can tell you is that the reports are consensus statements. And if there's anyone in the committee that can't stand within consensus on a particular issue, they are encouraged to write a dissenting opinion. And so every report that the National Academies writes is something that has gone through a lot of iterations and a lot of committee discussion, and also an extensive external peer review, where every single point that an external reviewer brings up, we have to address specifically and satisfy the National Academies review team.
Were there any dissenting statements in that? No.
There were not, yeah.
Okay.
So this was a full consensus report. So it would be fun if I could talk about it, but there's really not actually much interesting to say. It was a consensus, and the group really worked quite well together. Yeah, good question. Yeah. So how do we define engagement? We defined it as seeking and facilitating the sharing and exchange of knowledge, perspectives, and preferences between or among groups who often have differences in expertise, power, and values. So you'll notice this is very different than a public education campaign or traditional outreach. So outreach is very popular among scientists. Oftentimes the way they envision that is, I need to go out into the world and tell people what I know. Right? That's outreach. Engagement we define quite differently. And it can happen with scientists, it can happen among other types of groups as well. And furthermore, we talked about ways of thinking about engagement with different types of audiences. And I've written a little bit about this in terms of like the construction of audiences around scientific controversy. But what we talked about was how there are communities of people who have a kind of geographic belonging to a field trial of a technology, for example. Stakeholders who may not live in that area but have a professional or personal stake in the issue. And then broader publics. And that's not a typo, it's publics plural, because there is not simply the public out there. There are many ways to think about segmenting the public or constructing the public around these types of issues. So why would we do engagement? And I'm still drawing on this report in terms of our conclusions. One is for local knowledge. So if you know sort of the history of science and engineering, you know that there are many examples of experts deploying technologies that end up failing. And sometimes those failures are due to a lack of understanding of the local context for those technologies or that science. And so one of the benefits of engagement is to access that type of local knowledge that experts simply don't have because they're not a part of those communities. Secondly are principles of justice. So I know you don't probably know a lot about gene drives, but gene drives are a transformation of the shared environment. And so because of that, you might think about the importance of a kind of community or collective consent that would be similar to what we go through as an informed consent process for like a medical trial. But this is at the community level. And so ideas around transparency and informed consent become important when we're talking about transforming the shared environment. There's also opportunities for mutual learning between scientists and other types of experts or lay people. And finally, hopefully, the building of trust. And so if you know anything about the history of GMOs around the world, there's a real lack of trust between the scientists who are working on these technologies and broader publics. And the hope here is that through engagement, through a kind of ongoing conversation with different groups of people, you build that trust in a very different way than if you just show up at the end and say, ta-da, here's my technology, it's great, trust me, right? What are some of the challenges? One is who should be engaged? That's a really strategic question, and it's not always obvious, and we can talk about that a little bit more in the context of the case studies I'll present later. Second, what are the goals of engagement? So sometimes the goal is education. Sometimes the goal is to understand what people think. Sometimes it might be to affect the design of the technology that's under question. When should engagement occur? So a lot of scientists I talk to get very nervous about doing engagement at early stages of research because they say, well, we don't even know if this is going to work yet. What if we overpromise? Or what if we scare people about a technology because we haven't got all the answers yet? Other people have argued that kind of upstream engagement is really important, that we need to start those conversations before we have a final product in front of us. Cultural differences are a huge factor. I may not talk about this too much today, but one of my projects around the genetically engineered American chestnut tree, we did a fair bit of engagement with indigenous peoples. And questions of how to engage people who have very different worldviews, different political systems, different cultural traditions, raises a huge challenge. And I'd be happy to answer questions about that later. What are some of the potential triggers for polarization? So how do you organize an engagement, a deliberation, and not just simply drive people to the extreme positions? And then importantly, what are the results of engagement? How does it matter? Is it just window dressing? Do we do engagement because we want to say that we've done it? Or is there a kind of impact of those kinds of conversations and interactions? Yeah.
So I definitely recognize all of these as challenges of engagement.
Yeah.
But they look like they're geared towards the populations you want to engage rather than the people who are engaging them. And I imagine there might be different lists of challenges with that group.
Okay.
Yeah,
like what comes to mind?
Some of the scientists, I'm sure, have real reservations about sharing ongoing research that they feel proprietary rights over.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And like you mentioned, a hesitation of sharing things before you have real confirmation of findings.
Yeah.
And just, I think there can be the general fear of how to do that as a science professional without a background in engagement.
Excellent points. So really good points. And I will address some of, so the question about what does it mean to talk about a kind of proprietary and uncertain technology, I'll give a very specific example of that in a little bit. Yeah, that's a really good question. And the question of whether, you're alluding to a question that's not on this list, which is who should do the engaging?
Mm-hmm.
Are we expecting, your question is about, do we expect scientists who are experts in the lab to also become experts in engagement? Because that's a tall order, right? That's a lot to expect of people. Just like it would be a lot to expect of me to understand how to put together a genetic cassette for genetic engineering, which I don't know how to do. Right? You want to ask a question too? Yeah.
Yeah, and tell me if you'd like to hold off on this question because you might have things around it, but building off what Patrick said in your response. So you have these different people who have different perceptions within this huge academy. I was very curious about, I'm actually kind of surprised to see interest in this kind of engagement work because many of us in here are engaged type scholars.
Yeah.
And there's often this assumption that the national academies are not terribly interested in that, and that you almost need to hide it in funding proposals in order to get the money, and because they're like, oh, you're going to spend it on engagement, forget it, next. And we want papers and number charts and stuff. So are you telling us that that's not true, or that is this very niche within that, or is this growing and opening, or are there areas where it's becoming more accepted? Because I'd love to propose to them to give us money to do this.
Right. So they're not a funding agency, unfortunately. I'll tell you a couple things. One is, so every committee is constituted on its own, and so there isn't a national academy's position on engagement. What I can tell you is that the two committees I was involved in, one on gene drives and one in forest biotechnology, we emphasized issues of engagement and the importance of it in those reports. The other thing I'll say is that my experience working around emerging biotechnologies is that the scientists who are working on those, who are often have visions for sort of public good applications of biotechnology, are very aware that the history of GMOs is riddled with mistakes in terms of communication and in terms of the rollout of products. And so they are very interested in changing the strategy of scientists in terms of how they interact with the public around their technology. So there's a real appetite among these scientists that I work with for doing things differently. And that may not carry over to all other disciplines and applications of technology. Does that answer your question? A little bit?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I also understand the context.
Yeah, okay. And this is, so this actually is maybe a little redundant of what I've already talked about, but this is a useful typology from a social science article about public engagement. And what they basically say is that one way of thinking about different types of engagement is which way do you want the information to flow. Sponsor to the public is very much an education campaign. We're pretty good at that, or we have a lot of techniques around that. Information flow from the public to the sponsor, we can imagine things like opinion surveys and focus groups. We're also pretty good at that. We have some established methodologies for doing that. But this third way, which they call public participation, where information is flowing in both directions, arguably the hardest, arguably the most important, and it's expensive. It's resource intensive. We can't rattle off a Gallup poll in this third category. We don't have, this third category isn't institutionalized in the way that public opinion surveys are, for example, around emerging technologies or other types of issues. Okay, so what I want to do now is that's a kind of theoretical and conceptual background for the way I think about engagement. And what I want to do is I want to dive into 2 case studies from my work in the last couple of years to bring it alive a little bit. So the first one is around, I have a project funded by the National Science Foundation about the genetically engineered American chestnut tree. Anybody heard of that tree? Mm-hmm. No? Anybody ever seen an American chestnut tree? You have? You have? Where did you see it?
I think it was in a garden.
Okay.
It was in like a botanical situation.
They're very, very rare. And I'll tell you a little bit about the history of this tree because I think it's relevant to thinking about how does biotech fit into this. This is not a great quality picture, unfortunately, but these are American chestnut trees a long time ago. They were called the redwoods of the East. They were gigantic. Along the Appalachian, I have a map. Along the Appalachian Range, the estimates are that a quarter of the trees in some areas were American chestnuts. They're really important in terms of timber production. They produced a mast of nuts that were used by settlers and also indigenous people for food. A really dominant, important tree in that ecosystem for a long time. Around the turn of the 20th century, a fungal blight was accidentally brought to the United States on either a Japanese or a Chinese chestnut, and that blight started spreading from New York outwards. And it just, so the fungus attacks the tree, creates this canker, and then girdles the tree and kills everything above the canker. It killed somewhere between 4 and 6 billion chestnut trees. Billion. Within about 40 years, transformational for the landscape. Lots of efforts to try to get ahead of it, cut down the trees before they got infected. That might have killed the trees that might have had some native resistance to it. So in retrospect, we probably didn't do the smartest thing. But essentially, it wiped out the chestnut throughout its native range. And there's been a number of efforts to deal with this, but none have been successful yet. What exists now are these stumps, essentially in the woods, except for a few trees that might be in botanical gardens or out in Iowa or something far away from where the blight is. And the stumps keep sending up shoots, but the fungus is able to live on other trees, and so it just attacks those shoots and kills them. So it's called functionally extinct because it's alive, but it's not able to reproduce and thrive in the environment. So there's, that's funny. Okay, let me just go back here. That's the blight. This is just a picture of the kind of landscape that resulted from that. There's been an effort to use conventional breeding. So Chinese chestnuts are resistant to the blight. And so there's a way to crossbreed American chestnuts with Chinese chestnuts and get something that looks a lot like an American chestnut, but would have the resistance. That's been an ongoing project for about 50 years. And there is some promise, but there have been a lot of fits and starts. And there's not a lot of confidence that we're close to having a solution for this. There's also a new effort within the last 20 years to use biotechnology. So this is not an emerging technique. They're using the same kind of technique that has been used to transform our crops. So this is using agrobacterium to transform the chestnut trees. It's a kind of an elegant solution in that they use one gene that occurs in wheat and a lot of other plants, put it in the chestnut tree, and that gene expresses a protein that detoxifies the acid that the fungus uses to infect the tree. And so by detoxifying the acid, the chestnut trees survive. And that's been shown to work in the lab. They've done clonal propagation of these things, and they've also done field trials. And I started this project a couple of years ago, and just last month, maybe even this month, the regulatory package went in for the genetically engineered American chestnut. Why is this so interesting? This thing is the first GMO we've ever produced designed to spread and persist in unmanaged environments. It's a big deal. It's not meant for a plantation. It's meant to persist, right, and spread. We know that GM crops have spread a little bit and persisted in ways that we didn't intend them to, but that wasn't the intention. These things are intended to spread and persist in unmanaged environments, so to spread throughout our forests. It's a big deal in terms of how we understand them and also how our regulatory system deals with them. Yeah.
I don't want to derail where you're heading. I just was curious, can you think of other examples of similar technologies that are soon to come online? Is this unique in its entire endeavor? Are there others that they're working on?
Yeah.
Spread and persist?
There's a lot. So one of the reasons I'm interested in this field is because I have a background in environmental policy. I used to be an environmental activist. A lot of the opposition to GMOs and biotechnology has come out of the environmental community. I'm really interested to see how these types of technologies do or don't change the debate that we're having around biotechnology. I mean, what does it mean that we're making a GMO that's meant to solve a conservation problem? There's no patents. It's not owned by a company. There's not a profit motive, right? It's really different than Monsanto's Roundup Ready corn, right? But is it different enough? I don't know. That's what we're going to be learning over the next 5 or 10 years. And there's other products that I'll talk about one other one, but there's I'm involved in the IUCN, the International Union for Conservation of Nature, put together a task force around synthetic biology and biodiversity conservation, and I got appointed to that, and we released a report last year that talked about a whole range of technologies that are using synthetic biology that are imagined to have an impact on biodiversity conservation. So there's a lot out there being talked about, but nothing is quite ready to release. Yeah. So,
can I just ask about the picture of the plants in the lower left?
These,
Are those, I mean, how does it reproduce? Like, are those in danger of spreading already? Or I mean,
good question.
Because they're kind of seemingly
there's trees over there, right?
There's trees right over there. Like,
so the field trials that they got permits to do, they had to follow very strict protocols from the USDA in terms of like bagging the flowers so that the pollen wouldn't spread. And they would even have to report, like, I actually know of one case where a squirrel went up and chewed off one of the burrs and like ran off with it, and they had to report that to USDA as like an escape. Which
could already be escaped in the environment.
Well, so here's the thing. So unlike other GMOs that have like wild relatives in the environment, chestnut doesn't really, it's been wiped out. So there aren't, like, even though those look like nice trees that they could breed with, those aren't chestnuts. And the fertilized nuts can only go so far. So there was a lot of effort on paying attention to containment. That's like one of the bases of our testing of GMOs in the environment, is this priority of containment. So presumably there has not been any escape of chestnuts, but if they're deregulated, which is the way that our system approves a GMO, if they're deregulated, it means that they could be planted anywhere. And so then they could spread. So I hope I've convinced you that this is a controversial technology, but with some interesting promise of solving problems that people care about. So what is my role in this as a social scientist. What am I going to do? What I did was I decided that instead of trying to organize a major public engagement project, which I don't have the money for at this point, I would start with stakeholder engagement. And so I wanted to bring together a diverse set of stakeholders to talk about this tree and in particular how we would think about broader public engagement in the future. And so these are the kind of groups that I brought together. I won't go through them individually, but what I'll note is that we had the scientists who developed the tree. We had the major forest biotechnology company in the United States. The American Chestnut Foundation is this organization that's been around for about 50 years to restore the chestnut and recently endorsed the biotech approach. We had an indigenous group, I guess I am going to go through them all, an indigenous group that I partnered with. The most outspoken activist groups against GE trees, they have a campaign called Stop GE Trees. People from the Forest Service, people who are focused on chestnuts for production and sale, and the Nature Conservancy, among others. I'll just say that there are people who I brought together who really hate each other. And so part of the challenge was, what does it mean to bring those folks together for a conversation? We didn't do the conference in wingdings, although that might have been an interesting strategy. That's an Apple to PC problem, I think. But we did run a workshop. And we focused on this tree and public engagement. And so part of my premise was, if I got these people together and asked them, all right, once and for all, is this tree a good idea? That would explode, right? I'm not going to have a productive conversation. But if I got these people together and I said, all right, you all have different opinions about this tree, but could we all agree that broader public engagement is important on this technology? And if so, what might it look like? So some of our motivations for this workshop was to bring together a diversity of stakeholders as well as the innovators themselves, and also to expand beyond what's often called upstream public engagement. Or upstream engagement. So I'm in the field of science, technology, and society, where there's a lot of emphasis on thinking about technologies upstream before we have them in front of us. We wanted to admit that for this chestnut, we're not so upstream anymore. The technology is in front of us. It's not approved yet, but we're not going to impact the design. But there's a lot of decisions to be made in how this technology is seen by regulatory agencies and also in terms of how it might be deployed, managed, and monitored in the environment. So that was one of our innovations for this workshop, was to sort of separate out the temporalities of a technology's life and think about what is the role of public engagement at different points in a technology's life. So we released a report about this workshop. It's available online at the Genetic Engineering and Society website. I won't go into the details there. Happy to answer questions about it. But I guess, let me go back for a second. If I were to say, what are the takeaways from that experience? We did have some really productive conversations among people who disagreed. And some really interesting perspectives. I'll just give you one example. One of the representatives from the Center for Native Peoples and the Environment talked about how, from their perspective, it's questionable about whether we should try to restore species. They said maybe the chestnut was meant to go extinct, and so for us to intervene, even that prior question of whether it's proper for humans to intervene in this way, is on the table. In a way that it was never on the table for people in the American Chestnut Foundation or for the scientists who are making this tree. So that's a different kind of framing and set of assumptions that this workshop confronted people with. The other thing I'll say as a takeaway is it's very hard to get people to do the work that I thought I could get them to do, which is to design public engagement. That was probably too tall of an order for this workshop. And so I learned something in terms of being humble about what I could expect. Yeah.
I'm curious if you read the book, The Overstory.
I'm in the middle of it. I love it. Cool. It's such a good book, yeah.
I would be really curious if you see any impact on these conversations from artifacts like that, in which, so for those who haven't, the first big story in it is of a chestnut tree human interaction over generations, and I would say a lot of people in the public sphere have never heard of this event of the chestnut tree die-out,
Mm-hmm.
and now millions have
Yeah.
after that book, and it's gained popularity.
Yep.
And I really wonder how that factors in as a piece of outreach.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think there was any intentional connection there between that and this work.
Yeah.
But I wonder, thinking of future engagement and outreach
Mm-hmm.
opportunities, how weaving in literature and other forms of engagement
Yeah.
might expand possibilities and conversations as well.
Yeah. Great point. I mean, one thing I'll just say is that the main scientist behind this project, there's a TED Talk online, and he gives regular presentations to pretty broad audiences, and he has a very moving story, a narrative about the chestnut and why it was important and why this is worthwhile. So those issues of narrative are really important to this issue, way beyond just the science and the sort of risk assessment and things like that. Okay, let me jump to case study number 2. I do want to leave a little time for questions, so I'll work through this. So this is a different technology. I'm part of a consortium, an international consortium called the Genetic Biocontrol of Invasive Rodents, or GBIRD, for better or for worse. And what is this? So this is a question. This consortium is asking a question. Could we build a gene-drive mouse for biodiversity conservation? And I'll tell you briefly what the vision is. If a gene drive drives a trait through a wild population, what if the trait that you're driving through population is maleness? So if the trait is maleness and you release gene drive mice on an island where they are invasive, that population could then be predicted to go to all male within a few generations and then crash. And you would have removed the invasive mice from that island where they threaten biodiversity, especially birds and small mammals and amphibians and things like that. Why would you do that? Because current methods of getting rid of invasive rodents are highly toxic to the environment and highly problematic in other ways, which I could talk about later. But this group has partners all across the world. We have an NGO, some government agencies, different universities working on lots of aspects of this potential technology. We don't have one yet. Nobody has yet built a gene drive mouse with any trait, but there are ideas. This consortium is committed to thinking about the social and political and ethical issues along the way, and so that's why I'm proud to be a part of it. Just also following up on, I think, your point earlier, one of the outcomes of the Gene Drives report that I talked about earlier, where we focused on engagement, was that when DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, released a major funding call for gene drive research, they included funding for engagement, which they never do, right? And I would argue they did that because of the kind of recommendations that we made. Surprising to myself, I was a recipient of DoD funding through DARPA on a research project associated with this GBIRD technology. But there's a lot of other work going on, obviously, with this. So what did we start with? We started with a landscape analysis of interviewing very diverse stakeholders around the world, those who are already part of the debates around gene drives, but also those who aren't yet even thinking about it, asking them about their perceptions and their interests and their opinions and their concerns and hopes and worries about this technology. And so we released a report about from those interviews. And those interviews helped us set up a very similar type of workshop that I described for the chestnut tree, where again we brought together diverse stakeholders and the innovation team. And this was just under a year ago at NC State University. Just to give you a sense of the diversity of participants we had a lot of different folks in the room, and that was on purpose. We also, as I described before, we discussed this issue across different scales of research. So we organized our discussions around where is the science now, which is in the laboratory, trying to figure out what gene drive mechanisms are going to be most appropriate, because there's a bunch of different alternatives, and what kind of control methods are going to be a part of this mouse. It wouldn't take you too long to think about one of the primary worries about gene drives is that what if they escape? There's super spreaders they're not just like the tree that would have the ability to spread, but they're really meant to spread in ways that other organisms don't in terms of their traits. So there's some really interesting ideas about control mechanisms for gene drives I'd be happy to talk about. Yeah.
So just to clarify, the participant list here looks much more focused on experts in different realms related to this field.
Yes.
Rather than public participants, or?
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, although, I mean, so our effort here around getting conservation NGOs, animal welfare experts, those folks were people who have a kind of expertise, but we also saw as part of sort of civil society, organized civil society. These were not, so this is a stakeholder engagement exercise, not a public engagement exercise. We were not trying to bring quote unquote ordinary people into the room to talk about this.
Right.
I think that's an important phase at some point, but not yet.
And the last one you had native groups listed, and I don't see them here. Was that a choice or just a function of how this rolled out?
It wasn't a choice to exclude them, and I think it's actually a hole in our design. The reason why it made a lot of sense to include them in the Chestnut Workshop is because the tribal lands of some Native American groups overlap significantly with the Chestnut Historic Range, and we don't know where this technology is headed, and it might have been difficult to recruit indigenous peoples groups to come to a workshop where there's not even clarity about where this is going to happen and if it's going to happen near them. But it's certainly a hole. We didn't pretend to capture every group. I could talk more about some of our failures to recruit people that we really wanted to have at the workshop who didn't come. Yeah.
Let's say, so in terms of engaging people who weren't kind of already like a part of this, like how did you go about doing that? Like do you just like send out emails to people you think might be potential stakeholders in this, or?
So we used that landscape analysis to use those people's understandings of who might be relevant to talk to really create a broad list of people whose perspectives and opinions and understandings around this issue might be really important. So that was really our strategy. Yeah. So we talked about these different things. I'm not going to talk too much about those different phases, but I do want to focus on one thing that we did, which I was really proud of. So G-Bird doesn't have the mouse yet, nor have we selected the top 5 islands where we would release the mouse if we had one. But it's been an ongoing conversation, and within G-Bird, there has been a focus on what is the criteria for selecting an island. And we've developed some ideas about what are the right criteria. But because we didn't have real islands to talk about, for the purposes of this workshop, what we did was we created fictional island scenarios. So we used the criteria that G-Bird has been kicking around for ideas, and we made up islands that had interesting combinations of those criteria. None of them were perfect. In fact, we tried to design them so that participants would have a hard time deciding which one they would choose. And we organized a discussion at the workshop where we got people to circulate around tables and talk about each island scenario and what the positives and negatives were, and then make choices about where they would go if they had to make a choice, and then defend those choices. And it was one of the most sort of energetic and informative parts of the workshop, because what it really allowed people to do was to wrestle with the trade-offs that are really embedded in this decision. And we can all think of what is the ideal island, but it's unlikely that we're going to find the very perfect place. And so having this kind of conversation was really informative to the G-Bird team to be able to understand how a broader set of people would think about these trade-offs. It was really fun. So what are some of the lessons I take away from this? There was the participants, we interviewed them afterwards, and there was a real enthusiasm for this upstream engagement, to talk about this technology when it's still in the laboratory, when it's not certain that we can even do it. The participants appreciated being a part of the conversation. Second, they really liked being in conversation with what they saw as uncommitted developers. I put that in quotes because obviously the developers, the scientists, are pretty excited about the possibility of this technology, but they're also humble enough to say, we don't know if this is going to work, and we don't even know if it's the right solution. So one of G-Bird's principles is that if through processes of policy engagement or community and stakeholder engagement, there are groups of people that say, no, we don't want this, they will respect that. And that's a big deal for an innovation team to have that approach. I talked about the way that the scenarios enabled us to talk about trade-offs and also to think about these questions, not as just technical questions, but as ones that are part of our value systems as well. And those things are intertwined in important ways. Some of the concerns were, what does it mean for us to talk about technical options before we've done the safety studies? That's one of the trade-offs of upstream engagement. A concern that if we're focusing on this new tool of gene-drive mice, that it might undermine support for existing strategies. So we already go out and use massive rodenticide campaigns to dump on islands to eradicate invasive species. And in the conservation community, there's a lot of enthusiasm for that, but it has its downsides. Talking about this technology may raise awareness of those downsides in important ways, and that was concerning to some of our participants. Also a concern about how do we know when we're working for public acceptance to try to persuade people versus serving as honest brokers around a controversial policy issue. That report about the workshop is available at our website, and these are my key collaborators, so I was not doing this myself. Mahmoud Farouk is part of the ASU group. Katie Barnhill-Dilling is currently my postdoc, and Julie Shapiro is at the Keystone Policy Center here in Colorado. So I will stop there. We have about 10 minutes for questions. Yeah.
Have you encountered this kind of critique or issue of, so that we're doing this and it's going to solve some problem, but ultimately with the chestnut, it's because some mistake was made in human behavior that created a major thing, just like climate change. And ironically, I was talking with Lisa just yesterday about her geoengineering committee experience where they want to reorganize the chemical composition of the atmosphere to solve climate change. And I'm just like, oh, this is the wrong approach to solving problems. It's almost very apologist to these incredibly destructive and ridiculous practices. And very techno-determinist. Oh, we'll figure it out. We'll make a new widget that'll fix our bad behavior.
Right.
And that's just one way of spinning what we're looking at here. And I'm wondering if you've encountered that or
absolutely
thought about that angle and what's emerged in those kind of conversations.
Yeah, so great question. I mean, there are some really strong perspectives that capture those kinds of those arguments. So the Stop GE Trees campaign, for example, says, this is no solution to forest health. Forest health is a problem because of all these other things that we do to forests, right? And if you want to solve forest health, deal with those upstream causes, don't introduce a new technology that might have uncertain consequences and maybe make a bigger problem, right?
And be enablers too to those negative things.
Yeah. And so that is an argument that's deployed and very active. There are other people in the conservation movement who are really interested in thinking about whether some of these tools, these technological tools, could be useful. I think there are some people that argue that around issues of biodiversity loss and climate change, for example, the problem is so severe that we can't wind back the clock and undo what we've already done. And so if we do take on a kind of responsibility to solve a problem that we've caused, do we need to consider the range of tools, even ones that are higher technology and less understood by people? I think the mouse one is a pretty interesting case because what we've got is a huge percentage of the biodiversity on planet Earth, the terrestrial biodiversity, is on islands. And we have really serious problems with invasive species on islands. So that's where we are right now. We can't turn back the clock and undo the purposeful and accidental introduction of rodents on these islands. So what do? Some people argue we should do nothing. Some people argue that we should continue to use these traditional tools of rodenticides that work pretty well, but there's some real problems with those. They cause a lot of off-target effects on other animals. It's poison into the environment, and it causes horrible suffering for the animals themselves. The rodenticides basically make you bleed out from the inside. And you can't do that on bigger and bigger islands. So then what do? And the NGO that we're partnering with, Island Conservation, is really interested in whether there are tools enabled by genetics, whether it's gene drives or other types of technologies, that could help solve this problem in a way that would have less undesirable effects than the current management strategies. My own take is I think it's a reasonable question to ask. I don't know what the right answer is, but I think it's a worthwhile question to ask. Lisa, I don't think you've asked a question.
Yeah, I just was kind of piggybacking off what Lee's asking, but thinking you had a list of concerns, and one of them was, could this? You just said it. Could this deflect attention from other strategies that kind of work?
Right.
And I was and then the issue about enabling, and we use the word enabling, and one of the things I wrestle with thinking about these technologies is to what degree do these kinds of efforts sort of lend legitimacy to something that might actually be maybe not a positive thing in the end, but by engaging, doing this and participating and bringing in these kind of very thoughtful approaches, are we adding to the, in geoengineering we wrestle with two concepts: slippery slope, which is if you develop it, then you'll use it, and moral hazard, which isn't quite a moral hazard, but they use it this way, which is to say we'll mitigate less. So we might think of it as more like mitigation deterrent or some other word like that. If we had these technologies, we might lessen. So it's a little different because you've already got the rodents, and presumably nobody's saying let's add more rodents as we do this male drive, gene drive thing. So you're not in the same exact situation.
Yeah.
But I wonder about how people engaging in this field think about the actual act of doing this sort of activity, adding to the politics, adding to the legitimacy of it somehow.
So the metaphor that has been popular among opposition groups to the chestnut, for example, has been the Trojan horse. So that, this looks like a really nice technology, and it looks like it's aligned with environmental values, and yes, there's no patents on this technology, but the real purpose behind this effort is to get our regulatory system to approve GE trees for the first time. And if they do that, then we'll have an explosion of genetic engineering in our forests for plantation forestry purposes. And the suspicion is that that's the real motivation behind this project. So there are huge concerns about the kind of symbolic and political implications of these technologies. And I don't think we can untangle. There are some people who are just furious that the activists would raise this question. How dare they? They don't understand the American Chestnut Foundation and our principles, and they're misrepresenting the motivations of the scientists. And there's some truth to those claims, but it's also true that we're operating in a landscape that's complicated and interrelated. And so if our regulatory agencies approve the GE chestnut, it will have an impact on future applications of other GE trees that will be used for forestry. That's a political reality. It's an important question to raise. I'm not going to say what I think the right answer is, but I think it's appropriate to ask those kinds of questions because these technologies are not unique and living on their own. They represent fields of technology and ways of applying this kind of science in the world.
Yeah, there's a lot. The example in our case, it would be people saying, well, people are going to die. It's kind of you have the chestnut could be brought back. It sort of appeals to those kinds of, how could you not be for something that could save lives or sort of thing, and it becomes very, I can see the emotion getting high in that chestnut even as it does in geoengineering.
Yeah, and one of the most far along efforts to create a gene drive organism is around mosquitoes and mosquitoes to address malaria in African countries, and that hits very close to what you're talking about. Who has the right to decide whether the risks of a gene drive mosquito are worth it when malaria is having such huge impacts on people's lives? That's a really tricky question. You had a question?
I was actually going to bring up those mosquitoes and
okay.
If the work that you did with the rodents, how much it lended to the mosquito case, or how much there was back and forth between those two things.
Yeah, so Target Malaria is a mostly Gates-funded project that is trying to develop a gene drive mosquito to address malaria in African countries. And they actually have a funded community engagement program that is way ahead of what the G-Bird project has done. Nice to see you, Lisa. So they're doing a lot of work in communities as they're developing the technology, and they have particular challenges because they're talking about technologies in environments where people don't have, a basic education in biology. And so they have to start from a place that is different from where I need to start in this room, for example, and talking about what a gene drive is. There is some critique of what they're doing because the same people who are doing the engagement are all wrapped up into the technical team, so it's not like a neutral third party doing engagement. But my impression of what they're doing is that they're trying really hard to do something that's really complicated and difficult, and they're trying to do this kind of technology deployment in a different way than the kind of colonial imposition of technology that has so often been done in Africa. That's my take.
Great. We may have time for one more question if anyone has one.
You want to follow up?
For the workshops, I was just wondering if there's like an agenda that you normally follow so that it runs smoothly and people are receptive.
Yeah, so we spend a lot of time thinking about the agenda. I believe very strongly that if you're going to bring people together in a room who are in conflict, you need to control the conversation in a way that's productive. And so we spend a lot of time on our agendas and thinking about how to make sure that there's opportunities for everyone to be heard and for there to be a framing of questions that's open to everybody in the room. So the agendas are part of our workshop reports if you're curious about how we put them together, and there's certainly some overlap there. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for coming along.
Sure, nice to talk with you. Great questions too.
Excellent. Lisa had to just run out.